Funding for Lawmakers comes from
the University of West Georgia in Carrollton, ensuring a better life for Georgians in the 21st century. More than 100 programs of study prepare students for successful careers in the critical professions of education and nursing, as well as business and the liberal arts. The Georgia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of Georgia's business community, over 4,000 members strong, working with lawmakers for over 90 years to make sure that our state remains a place where companies thrive.
and by supporters of Georgia Public Broadcasting. Thank you.
Coming up on Lawmakers, the House votes to compensate John Jerome White, who was wrongly convicted and served over 10 years in prison. Our leadership series of interviews continues with Senate President Pro Tem Tommy Williams. And we'll talk with Tom Crawford of CapitalImpact.com for his thoughts on this week under the Gold Dome. Those stories and more are coming up next.
Live from Atlanta, this is Lawmakers. Here are your anchors, Wandy Lawson and David Zelski.
Hello, everyone. Also on tonight's broadcast, the Senate votes to give income tax credits for scholarship fund donations.
And we'll bring you our legislative scorecard on this 34th legislative day. But first, our top story tonight, restitution for a man who was wrongfully convicted. A man who served 10 years in prison after being wrongfully convicted of rape, burglary, and aggravated assault is one step closer to receiving compensation from the state. But passage of House Resolution 161 was preceded with questions about whether John Jerome White deserves an annuity package valued at over $700,000. Representative Caroline Hughley said wrongfully incarcerating this man at age 19 had caused irreparable damage even after he was released.
On June 22, 1990, Mr. White was paroled after serving 10 years and 10 months. The state of Georgia sent him home with a bus ticket and $25, and they also gave him a scarlet letter to wear on his chest. They sent him home as a sexual offender, and they sent him back to Meriwether County, and they told him to make it on his own. He had to go back to his hometown as the person who everyone in Manchester, Georgia believed raped, robbed, and beat a 74-year-old woman in her home.
Representative Tim Bearden tried to get the House to postpone the vote on the resolution. He challenges the amount of the award because John Jerome White has been convicted of other offenses. But Representative Carl Rogers, who chaired the Appropriations Subcommittee that approved the resolution, says the amount was derived through careful deliberation and it is deserved. First, Representative Bearden.
Right now, I'm also looking at a letter from the Secretary of State's office. The first H.R. 161 that came out was for $2 million. The board did not support H.R. 161. Now, the board did make a recommendation of $54,000 a year for 10 years, but we're looking at $700,000 on this. I believe Representative Hatfield pointed out there was a burglary charge before the rape charge. Then once he was released in 1990, in 1993, Mr. White was convicted for possession of cocaine and in prison for 2.5 years. After that release, he is convicted for robbery in 1997. And then the parole was taken care of or revoked on the wrongful conviction.
The committee worked for 2 hours. The subcommittee did, and we came up with a compromise. I know the Claims Advisory Commission advised $540,000. There was a movement to do it as much as $3 million. There was a motion to make it $1,500. So this was the compromise we came up with.
An attempt to table the resolution failed. H.R. 161 passed by a vote of 122 to 34. It now goes to the Senate. If signed by the governor, the money would be paid to Mr. White over a 20-year period, provided he's not convicted of future crimes. The House also votes today to allow inmates to transfer to transitional centers or work release programs during their final year of incarceration. Representative Sean Jurgensen presented Senate Bill 193.
This bill is about good public policy. It's not about being soft on crime, but it's about being smart on crime. These individuals have mandatory sentences and will be released at the end of their sentence. This bill would allow for the last year of their incarceration for them to be placed into a transitional center and engage in a meaningful work program. Research shows that transition prior to release is directly correlated to the reduction of recidivism of these individuals. Currently, at the end of these sentences, these individuals are released with $25 and a bus ticket. They have no job, no family, no support, and no place to live. And that equals a return to prison.
SB 193 passed without opposition and now goes to the governor for his signature.
Legislation giving individuals and corporations the option to donate to student scholarship organizations for tax credit passed the Senate today. That's HB 100, but not before a slew of questions from Democrats. Senator Eric Johnson, who carries HB 100, answers a couple of questions from Senator Valencia C. about how these credits work.
If an individual, an S Corp or LLC under this, owes taxes to the state, they can then get a tax credit if they donate it to this program? Is that
that's correct. They can contribute a specific amount. Say they want to contribute $1,000, they can do that. They are capped at 75% of what they would owe the state as a corporate or an individual. However, the overall cap every year is $50 million from everybody donating. So we haven't changed the overall cap. We've just made sure that anybody who wants to take advantage of this tax credit is capable of doing so.
Isn't it true that the law currently does not allow someone donating to one of these student scholarship programs to get a tax credit in Georgia when they're already claiming it as a 501c3 deduction in Washington on their federal taxes?
Yes.
Senate Majority Leader Chip Rogers then took the well in an effort to clarify the intent of the bill and to respond to Senator Nan Orrock's claim that this tax credit is a form of double dipping.
If the bill says that somebody investing in education gets a state tax credit, which they're already receiving, and now we have found a way to give that same person, allow them to have a federal tax credit, why would we be opposed to that?
Senator Steve Thompson then took the well to say that this bill is just another step towards a statewide school voucher system, whether they admit it or not.
Continually, I've heard that we're not moving toward a voucher system. Now, if you want a voucher system, you have that right. You have the right to feel that way. But don't tell me you're not moving in that direction. There's no secret. It's out there. It's what it appears that the majority party wants. But let's be honest about it.
And an amendment from Senator Orrock was voted down, so HB 100 ended up passing 35-12, receiving no Senate changes, so it now goes to Governor Perdue. And the Senate today failed to pass House Bill 550. This measure creates a third way for companies to convert from a mutual insurer company to a stock insurance company. Senator Ralph Hudgens explains the need for such legislation and is followed by Senator Seth Harp, who doesn't believe this bill will help the people of Georgia and only help a few select people within that company.
If a mutual company, insurance company in the state of Georgia wants to convert to a stockholder company, they have two options. This will be a third option. And all this option is saying if a person owns $100,000 worth of policy, they have value in the company, then if that insurance company will give them a paid-up life insurance policy with $100,000 worth of cash value that they could cash out if they wanted to. If they wanted to hold the policy and receive the death benefit, they could do that.
I strongly urge you to vote against this bill because what you're doing is setting up a robbery of the people who have the insurance policy in this question. And if that's what you want to do, vote for it, because all you're doing is opening the door to allow that to happen.
HB 550 ended up failing 23-26. Senator Hudgens then made a motion to reconsider, which will occur the next legislative day this Monday. And the Senate passed a bill today that targets producers of false identification or documents. Under this legislation, having the word novelty printed on a false ID will no longer be a defense for charges of manufacturing, selling, or distributing false identification documents. Senator John Wiles explains what is currently happening in Georgia.
House Bill 71 simply removes the ability of someone selling a, quote, novelty ID, the ability to sell it. And what current Georgia law, which was passed several years ago, allowed you to sell an ID that was at a flea market as long as it said for novelty use only. And the law had indelible ink on it, but it turns out the next booth in the flea market was the acetone booth, where you would just wipe the indelible ink off and you would walk out with a ID that looked just as good as a Georgia ID. And the GBIs came to us and asked us to make this change, and that's what it does.
HB 71 passed unopposed, but it did receive changes in Senate committee, so it now goes back to the House. And Senate Majority Leader Chip Rogers stated in a press conference yesterday that creating jobs is the legislature's #1 priority this year and believes House Bill 481, which is now in Senate rules, aims to do just that. However, this afternoon I talked with Senator Nan Orrock, who says each job created under this legislation will cost the state more than $265,000. We begin with Rogers' statement from yesterday.
At the top of the priority list are the jobs bills that the House has passed. We passed out of a Senate committee. We added to that, offering even more tax relief for those companies that are providing jobs in the state of Georgia and creating economic development. We want to send a message, a very clear message, that if you want to do business, there is no better state in America than Georgia to open up, do business, or expand your current business.
They're promising to create new jobs. The numbers show that each of those new jobs is $265,000 hit on the state budget. Now, if we can afford that kind of reckless spending, I'm sure that the worker and their family would say, hey, if you've got that kind of money to buy us a job, why don't you just let us have that money? We are in a budget shortfall. We are at record numbers of unemployment. We have more people needing Medicaid and health care that comes out of our state budget. And to be throwing around state dollars so recklessly, it's very disturbing. What we risk doing is that this kind of reckless legislation can actually damage our bond rating in Georgia, and then we will be in a deep, deep hole.
We invite you to check out GPB's online resources at gpb.org/lawmakers. Find the latest from GPB Radio News and watch Lawmakers online. All that and more is at gpb.org/lawmakers.
Our leadership interview series continues today with Senate President Pro Tem Tommy Williams. I spoke with Senator Williams late yesterday and began by asking him about his title change from Majority Leader to Senate President Pro Tem.
Well, I picked a tough year to do this job, and of course I'm elected by all the senators, which is it's an honor to be chosen by them to be the pro tem. But it's a bad year in terms of the budget and one's ability to do some things we'd like to do just because we don't have the funds.
Well, let's talk about that budget. When we started the session, we were already in a bad place, but it seems like every month when the revenue estimates come, it gets worse and worse and the situation is more dire. How has that been dealing with that budget and controlling things?
Well, we thought last fall we were about 1.2 billion down. By December, we were 1.6 billion down. By January, we were another 262 million down just in the month of January. So we're at about $3 billion down in the 09 budget. 10 is just as bad, if not worse. And we're just waiting on the March revenue numbers to see, how much worse it's going to be. We do actually think March is ticking up a little bit, and we hope so, or else we'll be back up here adjusting the budget in the summer.
Now, the stimulus money did bring, I'm guessing, an estimate about $1 billion in. How much has that helped? And if it gets worse, I guess we are going to have to do cuts that we were looking at earlier.
Well, if we were $3 billion down and we got $1 billion, that means we're $2 billion down. So those are still significant cuts. In a $18 to $20 billion budget, to cut $2 billion is a tough job, and you can't do it without hurting some agencies. Especially when we're constitutionally required to educate children. We have to keep prisoners locked up. We have to keep our roads open. A lot of things that we have to spend the money on, And because we're a growing state, we continue to have some Medicaid growth. So it's tough to make cuts when you're a growing state.
Well, let's talk about another issue. We knew this was going to be an issue this year, that is transportation. At the beginning of the session, we thought there was a lot of agreement between House and Senate leadership, but as the weeks went by, we found out they may not quite be on the same page, but it seems to have come together lately with Transforming Transportation Act. If you could talk about that, and also a little about the T-Splosh as well, where we are with that.
Well, the funding is probably the biggest issue that we've discussed over the last 2 years. What the Senate has done, we've always thought that to let the voters decide based on a project list in their county or region what was best, let them come up with that project list, and then they vote on whether they like that list and want to fund it with a sunset, just like we do the educational SPLOST. So we proposed that, proposed it last year and this year. We thought we had agreement from the House. They've gone in a different direction, and hopefully we'll come back to where we are. In terms of reforming the department, the problem with the department is they just have forever taken so long to get projects out the door. And that's come as a result of the fact that there are 13 members elected by congressional district by the legislature, and frankly they're pulling in 13 different directions rather than deciding what it is we need to do to solve congestion problems, what we need to do in terms of economic development throughout the rest of the state, and then let's put those projects on a list and don't deter from it until we get them done, and then we add more projects. So that's what we're trying to get to with a new governance bill. We're having some difficulty in the House, but hopefully they'll come around and we'll get that bill passed.
Okay. Senate President Pro Tem Tommy Williams, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, with 6 days left in this session, we take a look back at some of the bills we've been tracking on our legislative scorecard. The governor signed the supplemental budget 1 week ago. The big budget passed the House yesterday and was immediately transmitted to the Senate Appropriations Committee. In business, the governor's plan to protect landowners who open their property for agritourism is currently in the House Judiciary Committee. 2 measures, including tax breaks for businesses, have cleared the House. The Jobs, Opportunity, and Business Success Act of 2009 is currently in Senate rules. And the Senate Insurance and Labor Committee is currently considering House Bill 581, the Georgia Works Job Creation and Protection Act. On the criminal justice front, a bill that would create the sentence of life without parole for murder convictions was recommitted to House rules earlier this week. Although the House recommendations for the 2010 budget include money to cover the outstanding expenses incurred by the Georgia Public Defender's Standards Council, the General Assembly is considering an overhaul of that agency. The House State Institutions and Property Committee is considering a measure requiring some prisoners to be tested for HIV prior to release. The House Judiciary Non-Civil Committee is considering a Senate bill that would allow victims and witnesses of crimes to collect damages for serious mental and emotional trauma. The House voted to include online interaction as one of the venues in which child molestation may be charged. Several education measures failed to gain traction and pass either body before day 30. SB 90, allowing families to use state money to transfer their children to public schools outside their communities or to private schools, did not clear the Senate Rules Committee by crossover day and may be dead for this year. The governor's proposal to give $10,000 annual bonuses to high-performing principals, SB 93, remains in the Senate Education and Youth Committee. And HB 282, providing bonuses to teachers who earn Georgia Master Teacher Certification, is still in the House Education Committee. Environmental issues considered this session include the Georgia Nuclear Financing Act, allowing Georgia Power to bill customers in advance for future nuclear plant projects. SB 31 has cleared the Senate and the House and now awaits the governor's signature. In public safety, the governor's super speeder legislation to increase fines for habitual speeders is currently in Senate Public Safety, as is HB 23, prohibiting drivers under 18 from using cell phones or text messaging while behind the wheel. The House Agriculture and Consumer Affairs Committee is considering SB 5, adding pickup trucks to vehicles in which seatbelts must be worn, and HB 22, providing that seatbelts must be worn in trucks and the back seat of cars. And the House Judiciary Committee has SB 23, allowing failure to use seatbelts to be used as evidence in lawsuits. House Motor Vehicles is considering SB 67, requiring that driver's license exams be given only in English. 3 consumer taxes appear dead for this session. SB 91 would tack a $5 surcharge on adult entertainment. The Pass the Buck legislation to pass a $1 tax on cigarettes and tobacco products remains in House Ways and Means, as does HB 67, which would place a 4% sales tax on groceries. The General Assembly vows to pass transportation legislation this session. Thus far, SB 200, a major overhaul of the Department of Transportation, is currently in the House Transportation Committee. Senate Resolution 44, the Transportation Local Option Sales Tax, is in the House Transportation Committee. HB 277, the Georgia 2020 Transportation Act, a 1% statewide sales tax, is in Senate rules, as is H.R. 206, creating the Transportation Trust Fund. And that's our legislative scorecard for Legislative Day 34 of the 2009 Georgia General Assembly. And late this afternoon, the Senate Rules Committee placed both HB 277, the Georgia 2020 Transportation Act, and H.R. 406, the Transportation Trust Fund, on the Senate calendar for Monday. We'll bring you complete coverage of that debate Monday night on Lawmakers.
Well, today marks the end of the 9th legislative week under the Gold Dome. Time to check in with Tom Crawford, national editor of CapitolImpact.com. And I began by talking to Tom about the FY 2010 $18.6 billion budget, which recently passed the House.
The House put back about, well, actually more than $200 million that Governor Sonny Perdue had cut in the form of lower Medicaid payments to doctors and hospitals. There was a lot of concern that this might force some hospitals to close. The House put the money back. I'm not sure if it will stay there entirely once it gets back to the Senate, but it was a decision that the hospitals were very pleased with. The House version of the budget also, I believe, cuts about $197 million in QBE formula funding for local schools. That's been a problem for the last 5 or 6 years. They also took out another $112 million in equalization grants for local school systems. So the schools took a little bit of a bath on that one. They did put some money in to hire additional food safety inspectors over at the Department of Agriculture. That was a response to the situation in Blakely with Peanut Corporation of America and its tainted food products. So that's probably an action that's good for Georgia consumers.
And that peanut bill did end up passing. The Senate agreed to the House changes yesterday, so that was something this week. Concerning Medicaid in the budget, the governor ended up writing a letter to the House Speaker and Lieutenant Governor. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, the governor in his letter said he was concerned that they're still about $150 million short of having enough to cover what he expects to be the growth in enrollment in Medicaid, because with the recession going as it is, a lot of people are losing their jobs and qualifying for Medicaid coverage. So that is an issue that might hang up the final approval of the budget. I know Lieutenant Governor Casey Cagle indicated that he agrees with the governor's assessment of the Medicaid situation. I think there might be some disagreement over on the House side. So that's an issue to be resolved in the negotiations.
And I wanted to bring up one more thing. Obama has been the word around especially in the House over the last week. Let's talk a little about what happened this week in the House dealing with our president.
Some black legislators drafted a resolution commending Obama and naming him an honorary member of the Legislative Black Caucus. It's the kind of resolution that both the House and the Senate passes, dozens of them every day without even thinking about it. On this particular one, some of the Republicans in the House objected to some of the language. They felt it was, I guess, too commendatory of Obama. So they would not vote on the bill when it first came up Thursday afternoon, or they defeated it narrowly. And that angered some of the black lawmakers. They had another vote this morning, Friday morning, to reconsider the resolution, and which they did. But rather than allow another vote immediately, Speaker Glenn Richardson sent the measure back to the Rules Committee. That made the black lawmakers even angrier. Several of them staged to walk out from the House chambers, but they did eventually come back. And things seemed to calm down a little bit later in the morning when they passed a resolution to compensate a black man who had been unjustly imprisoned on a rape conviction that was later overturned by DNA evidence. So a bit of a hostile morning there.
All right, well, Tom Crawford of CapitalImpact.com. Tom, thanks again for helping out this week.
Glad to do it.
And as Tom and David were just discussing, a House resolution making President Obama an honorary member of the Legislative Black Caucus is being sent back to House Rules. Members of the Black Caucus walked off the House floor earlier today in protest. After House Speaker Glenn Richardson sent House Resolution 673 back to Rules, Democratic leader DuBose Porter spoke against attempts to block the honorary measure.
I'm hoping that this is about partisanship and not something else. I'm hoping in 2009 in Georgia that we're talking about political differences where we see the world maybe differently and not something else. And to get past that, to make sure it's not something else, that the one or two words that we don't like I was in the situation with who should run for Speaker of this House, that when there's something like that, let's move beyond that and respect the privileged resolution of a member of this House.
House Resolution 673 is back in House Rules, where it will have to receive approval in order to return to the floor for a vote.
Senator Ed Harbison was one of 3 Democrats to take the well yesterday to discuss veteran issues, including their appreciation for the Senate recently passing SB 114, which allows the transfer of students who are military dependents into a local school system. Senator Harbison explains.
I rise to express some strong feelings about our veterans and the goodwill I have towards the Senate for passing Senate Bill 114. I can't say enough about it because I know you understand that the comments we make by the bills we pass goes a long way. That Senate Bill 114 is a national story. It has been highlighted nationally. We understand in Georgia that we take care of our veterans, and in this instance, our veterans' children, 40,000 plus, and they'll be growing even more with the advent of more troops into our area in the very near future because of the base closure of black operations into Columbus, Fort Benning, and other posts in this city, in this state.
Again, Senate Bill 114 has passed the Senate. That legislation now awaits action in the House Education Committee. Well, coming up next week on Lawmakers, our leadership series of interviews continues with Senate Democratic Caucus Chair Tim Golden. We'll have that interview and all the latest from under the Gold Dome when Lawmakers returns on Monday, March 23rd at 7 p.m. And if you have missed any part of this Lawmakers broadcast, tune in tomorrow morning when Lawmakers repeats at 7 a.m. and when Lawmakers repeats on GPB Knowledge. This episode of Lawmakers also repeats Monday morning at 5:30 a.m. here on GPB Television. Well, coming up on GPB, Alone in the Wilderness. That's next.
Well, that's our broadcast for the 34th legislative day of the 2009 session of the Georgia General Assembly. I'm Wandy Lawson.
And I'm David Zelski. Join us Monday at 7 p.m. for the next Lawmakers. Have a great weekend.
Good night.
This has been a production of Georgia Public Broadcasting.